In part 1 of our story recap of The Legend of Zelda, we covered the events shown in Skyward Sword, the first game in the chronology, talking about the creation of the Triforce, the Master Sword, the beginning of the settlement of Hyrule, and the origins of the cycle of conflicts between Ganon, Link, and Zelda. In part 2, we're going to briefly take a look at the Capcom-developed Minish Cap and Four Swords before talking about the fateful events of the Hyrule Civil War, which is covered in the Hyrule Historia. Following that, we will talk about some of the events portrayed in Ocarina of Time. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is, without a shadow of a doubt, the most important game as far as the series' overarching narrative is concerned. It is the game that every other title in the series pivots around, the game that serves as the foundation for so many things. It makes sense then that we will be spending a considerable amount of time talking about it. Before we get to that though, it's important to take a little bit of time and talk about some of the other games in the series. The Legend of Zelda, Minish Cap, and Four Swords, both developed by Capcom, are the games that follow Skyward Sword in the series' chronology. However, they're largely unconcerned with a lot of the things that serve as the main talking points in most of the Zelda games. The Triforce, Ganon, the Master Sword, these are all things that the stories of Minish Cap and Four Swords don't really have much room for. That said, both games are still canon, so we can't just flat out ignore them. Very briefly then, let's talk about the events of the two games in question. But before we move forward, it is important to keep a very vital piece of information in mind. This is something that has caused a lot of confusion for a great number of people, and even though this is commonly known to most fans of the Zelda franchise, we feel it is still important to get this out of the way before we continue onward. The character of Link that we follow throughout the series is not one single person, just as the many renditions of Zelda throughout the series are not the same person either. For instance, the Zelda and Link that we see in Skyward Sword are not the same Zelda and Link we see in Ocarina of Time, who in turn are not the same Zelda and Link we see in Twilight Princess or the ones in Wind Waker or A Link to the Past, and so on. They're actually reincarnations, Zelda being the reincarnation of the Hylia, and Link being the reincarnation of the spirit of the hero of the goddess, the hero who defeated Demise during the events of Skyward Sword. So keep that in mind as we continue with this series, remembering that the Links and Zeldas in almost every game are completely different people from the ones we've already spoken about. There are a few instances where we follow the stories of the same Link and the same Zelda across more than one game, but those are the exception to the rule, and we'll be sure to clearly mention that for your benefit every time that it happens. Although it's important to note that Ganon, the reincarnation of Demise's hate, is one single entity, one single being throughout the entire series. His very first appearance in terms of chronology is in Ocarina of Time, and every subsequent time we see him in Zelda games, he is the same person, the same being. With that out of the way, let's get back to briefly talking about the series' narrative itself. Before we get into our overview of Minish Cap and Four Swords though, there is a pretty major event that we need to cover first. That event is known in the histories of Hyrule as the Interloper War, which takes place between the events of Skyward Sword and Minish Cap, with a gap of a large number of years, possibly even centuries on each side. It was around this time that the knowledge of the Triforce became quite common throughout Hyrule, and it was this very fact that led to a great deal of widespread conflict. The Triforce, you see, now lay within a plane of existence known only as the Sacred Realm. However, once knowledge of the Sacred Realm and the Triforce became common, various tribes and races all across Hyrule attempted to bring the artifact under their control. The entire kingdom erupted with bloody conflicts, becoming engulfed in a massive war. Of all the various factions that fought for control of the Sacred Realm and the Triforce within, at the forefront, with the fiercest and most terrifying efforts, were the Interlopers. The Interlopers were a tribe of powerful sorcerers, and their efforts in the fight to gain control of the Sacred Realm and the Triforce within were perhaps among the most vicious of all. We'll speak more of the Interlopers later on in this series, but for now, let's just say that eventually they were banished from Hyrule, sealed away and sent into a parallel dimension known as the Twilight Realm. As a result of this, the Interloper War finally came to an end. We now move forward to speak about the events of Minish Cap, which take place a fairly long number of years after the events of the Interloper War. It isn't known exactly how long, but Hyrule has become a well-established kingdom by the time the game begins, so it's fair to say that it has been at least a few centuries since the people of Hyrule fought in the war, having now recovered from that conflict, and even longer since the denizens of Skyloft properly resettled the world that was once known only as the Surface. Viewed in isolation, Minish Cap actually has a lot of narrative content to go through, but seeing as most of it is, ultimately, largely inconsequential to the series' larger story, we're not going to go into too much detail. Let's instead talk about its most major plot points and the things it introduces to the Zelda universe. One of those things is, of course, the Minish, a race that is known to the people of Hyrule as the Picori. The Picori are a race that possesses great knowledge and wisdom, as well as an impressive command over magical skills. But interestingly enough, they're all very small in size. They're literally smaller than your fingernails. The legend has it that throughout the course of history, the Picori have aided the people of Hyrule in several ways. For instance, back when Hyrule was still infested with monsters and dangerous beasts, the Picori gifted its inhabitants with the magical Picori blade to help with their eradication. Not all Picori are as helpful though. One Picori known as Vati was consumed by his greed for power, which corrupted him to the point where he became a powerful and twisted and regular-sized sorcerer. Vati serves as the main antagonist of Minish Cap, and the end of the game sees him being defeated, as well as the closing of the gate to the Minish world. Sometime after the events of Minish Cap, however, Vati returns to Hyrule. This time he is defeated by a boy named Link. Remember, this is not the hero of the goddess, but an entirely different person, who uses the power of the Four Sword, a magical blade which allows him to split himself into four, essentially creating 3 copies of Link in addition to the actual Link himself. Link uses the weapon's powers to his advantage, ultimately sealing Vati inside the Four Sword. Both these things make a return to the Zelda storyline though, during the events of the third game in the series' chronology, that being aptly titled Four Swords. Vati returns once again to the land of Hyrule, having somehow broken free from his seal, and a new hero, also named Link, once again uses the Four Sword to send the sorcerer back into the seal he happened to be trapped in. There is, of course, a lot more to the narrative of both the Minish Cap and Four Swords, and there are a lot of details that we have, admittedly, simply glossed over, in light of their relatively lower importance to the larger narrative arc of the franchise. Having spoken about the most important story threads from these 2 games though, let's skip forward once again by what is presumably a few more centuries, 10 years prior to the events of Ocarina of Time. It is around this time that Hyrule erupts once more into a state of war. The exact reason for this war is unknown, since history seems to be a little vague and fuzzy about this period of time. But what is known is that all of the major sects, tribes, and races of Hyrule become indulged in violent infighting against each other, vying for dominance over the rest. This was known as the Hyrulean Civil War, or the Unification War. Almost all major factions of Hyrule were involved in this historic event. There were, of course, the Hylians, the most prominent inhabitants of Hyrule. There were the Gorons, a race of hulking, rock-eating mountain dwellers. There were the Zora, an aquatic blue-skinned race of human-fish hybrids. There were the Sheikah, a tribe of highly skilled ninja-like warriors who we already spoke of a bit in part 1 of this series. The Sheikah tribe have throughout history served as the protectors of the royal family of Hyrule, which makes a great deal of sense when you think back to the dynamic that Zelda and Impa shared in Skyward Sword. It is, incidentally, also believed that as a result of the Civil War, the Sheikah tribe was almost eradicated. And then there were the Gerudo, who are a reclusive tribe of desert dwellers that consist almost entirely of women, and has historically been known to harbor great disdain and a lack of respect for the Hylians, who they view as inferior to themselves. Once every 100 years or so, a male is born into the Gerudo tribe, and according to their culture, that man is revered as their king. This piece of information will become important as we go forward, so keep it in mind. Getting back to the Civil War though, eventually the conflict comes to an end, when the King of Hyrule successfully managed to quell the conflicts by finally reunifying the kingdom and bringing it under one single banner. The Civil War left a lot of destruction in its wake. It tore Hyrule apart, killing countless people and destroying the lives of even more. One such person was a certain Hylian woman, who attempted to flee the horrors of the war to save the life of her son, an infant boy who would later go on to be known as the Hero of Time. Yes, you guessed it. This infant we're speaking of is the Link of this generation, the reincarnation of the hero of the goddess. To protect herself and her son from the ravaging civil war, Link's mother fled to a place near the outskirts of Hyrule proper that is known as the Kokiri Forest, a forest that is guarded and occupied by a diminutive and mysterious race that is quite childlike in appearance, known as the Kokiri. or the children of the forest. By the time Link's mother reached the forest, she had sustained grave injuries. Realizing that her life was soon about to come to an end, she entrusted the care of her son to the guardian spirit of the Kokiri Forest, a massive sentient tree that was known to the Kokiri as the Great Deku Tree. The Deku Tree sensed that Link was a child of destiny, that he would play a very important role in the events yet to unfold, and as such, he promised to his dying mother that he would watch over the boy and let him live his life hidden among the Kokiri. Though it's never said directly in Ocarina of Time itself, the implication here is obvious. The Deku Tree was able to sense that Link was the reincarnation of the hero of the goddess, the hero who defeated Demise, and as such is destined to meet the reincarnation of Demise's hate in battle. We now skip forward 10 years to the beginning of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. The child known as Link has been living his life in the Kokiri Forest, among the Kokiri but not quite as one of them, and having known nothing but peace and quiet up until now. Lately though, strange things have been happening to Link. For starters, he's been plagued by nightmares of a girl fleeing on horseback from an evil man clad in black. As Ocarina of Time kicks off, Link wakes up from that very same nightmare. He's woken up by Navi, a fairy of the forest. Navi tells Link that she's been sent by the Great Deku Tree, who wants an audience with him, presumably about something urgent that he needs to speak with him about. Wasting little time, Link makes his way to the Deku Tree, who tells him that he needs Link's help. The Deku Tree, you see, was put under a curse quite recently by a man known as Ganondorf. Why? Well, the Deku Tree is a guardian of the Kokiri's Emerald, which is one of 3 objects that are known as the Spiritual Stones. Exactly what these stones are and why they're important to the story is something we'll speak of in a little while. But what you need to know is that Ganondorf demanded the Kokiri's Emerald from the Deku Tree, and when the Deku Tree refused to hand it over, Ganondorf placed a death curse upon him. The Deku Tree has sensed that the time is soon coming for the spirit of the hero to fight for the survival of Hyrule once again, and so he gives Link a pretty major task as a sort of test of his abilities. He opens his gargantuan mouth and asks that Link go into his insides, fight off the curse, and ultimately break it. With Navi by his side, Link enters the Deku Tree's innards, and after fighting off a massive monster known as the Queen Goma, essentially a giant terrifying spider, Link is able to lift the curse. When he makes it out though, the Deku Tree delivers some rather bad news to him. He informs Link that though he managed to break the curse, his efforts were ultimately too little too late, and that by now its effects have already taken too much of a toll on the guardian of the forest, whose death is now inevitable. Sensing that he is in his last moments of his life, the Great Deku Tree tells Link about the 3 goddesses that created Hyrule, Farore, Nehru, and Din, and about the creation of the Triforce, all of which we've already discussed in part 1 of our series. The Deku Tree then tells Link that he's destined to thwart a looming evil and restore peace to Hyrule. He gives him the Kokiri's Emerald, telling him about its significance. The 3 spiritual stones you see together function as the key to the gate that leads to the Sacred Realm, the realm where, as you might remember, the Triforce is kept hidden. As such, anyone who wishes to enter the Sacred Realm would first have to collect all 3 stones. The Deku Tree tells Link that he must then travel to Hyrule Castle to seek an audience with the princess named Zelda, and with these final instructions, the guardian spirit of the forest finally dies. With this mammoth task set on his shoulders, Link leaves the safety of the Kokiri Woods and travels to Hyrule Castle, where he then meets the young girl known as Princess Zelda, this current era's reincarnation of Hylia, the very same girl he had been having nightmares about. Zelda tells Link that she had seen dreams about meeting him and his fairy companion Navi. Link then proceeds to show her the Kokiri's Emerald, and seeing that the Deku Tree entrusted him with one of the spiritual stones, she reveals some very important pieces of information to him. Ganondorf, the man who placed the curse upon the Deku Tree, actually works as an advisor for Zelda's father, the King of Hyrule, and coincidentally, he's also the man who's been chasing Zelda in Link's nightmares. Ganondorf, you see, is an incredibly vicious and power-hungry man, and he's come up with a plan to enter the Sacred Realm, seek out the Triforce, and through it, use the ancient wish-fulfillment power of the gods. For that purpose, he's been secretly attempting to take possession of all 3 spiritual stones. Incidentally, Ganondorf is also a member of the Garuda tribe, being a male Gerudo. He is also their king. Though his insatiable lust for power serves as his primary motivation for wanting to get his hands on the Triforce, he also wants to make use of it for the betterment of his own people. This is something we will speak of in greater detail when we talk about The Legend of Zelda: Wind Waker later on in this series. Zelda tells Link that she tried to warn her father about the covert betrayal by his advisor, Ganondorf. The king, however, paid no heed to her warnings, which is why the princess now turns to Link for help. With no one else to turn to, Zelda asks Link to travel to Death Mountain and Zora's Domain, the homes of the Gorons and the Zora, respectively. Both the Gorons and the Zora, just like the Kokiri, are each guardians of one of the 3 spiritual stones. Link's objective now is to retrieve the Goron's ruby and the Zora's sapphire before Ganondorf can get his hands on them. Following this, Zelda intends to use the Triforce to foil Ganondorf's schemes and ensure the safety of Hyrule. The next part of Ocarina of Time sees Link traveling to these 2 locations, tackling and beating trials and dungeons. Eventually, he manages to successfully retrieve both spiritual stones, and with all 3 of them in his possession, he returns to Hyrule Castle to inform Zelda of his success. When he reaches Hyrule Town, things quickly take a turn for the worse. Though the 3 spiritual stones are the key to opening the gate to the Sacred Realm, those who wish to open the gate actually need one more item to be able to do so. That item is the mystical instrument known as the Ocarina of Time. The gate to the Sacred Realm is hidden in a structure that is known as the Temple of Time, locked away behind an entryway named the Door of Time. To open the Door of Time, one needs to use the 3 spiritual stones, but that's not all that needs to be done. Only when someone plays a melody known as the Song of Time on the Ocarina of Time in conjunction with using the 3 keys will the Door of Time be opened, and only then will that someone have access to the Sacred Realm. The Ocarina incidentally has been under the care of the royal family of Hyrule for generations. As things stand right now, the mystical instrument lies in the possession of Zelda. Ganondorf, knowing that he needs the Ocarina to open the Door of Time, attacks Hyrule Castle. Just as Link arrives after having collected all 3 spiritual stones, he sees something that echoes his nightmares from earlier. He sees Zelda fleeing from the castle on horseback, with the help of her protector, Impa, a warrior of the Sheikah tribe. And no, this is not the same Impa we saw in Skyward Sword. Zelda glances at Link as she rides away, and as her horse crosses the drawbridge leading out of Hyrule Town, she tosses the Ocarina of Time into the moat underneath. Close behind, Ganondorf chases her in pursuit on his own horse. When he sees Link standing in his way, he blasts him with a spell of dark magic, knocking him out of the way, and unbeknownst to the fact that the Ocarina is no longer in Zelda's possession, continues his chase of the princess. Link proceeds to jump into the moat beneath the drawbridge and recovers the Ocarina of Time. As he does so, he is contacted by Zelda via a telepathic message. She teaches him the Song of Time and tells him to head to the Temple of Time, unlock the gate to the Sacred Realm, and use the power of the Triforce before Ganondorf can do so. Link hurries to the temple with haste. As he stands before the Door of Time, he uses the spiritual stones and plays the Song of Time, finally opening the door. As he steps through, rather than finding the gateway to the Sacred Realm, he chances upon something else entirely, something he did not expect to see. Before him, resting in what is known as the pedestal of time, Link sees a legendary weapon, the Sacred Blade, the bane of all evil. He sees the Master Sword. As you might remember, at the end of Skyward Sword, the hero of the goddess plunged the Master Sword into a pedestal. While this has never been confirmed by any of the Zelda games or by Nintendo themselves, there is a strong possibility that the pedestal of time might be the very same place where it was placed at the end of Skyward Sword. It could not have possibly been moved since only one possessing the spirit of the hero can pull out the Master Sword. As for the various mechanics surrounding the blade, it is indeed true that they were not even remotely present in Skyward Sword. That said, given the gap of at least centuries between it and Ocarina of Time, there's every chance that these mechanisms were built around it as the years went by for protection of both the Master Sword itself as well as the entrance to the Sacred Realm. That said, don't take us at our word. Given Zelda's knack for inconsistencies and Nintendo's knack for constantly changing things around, there's every possibility that we're completely wrong about this and that the two locations are not one and the same. Anyways, let's get back to the recap. Link steps up to the pedestal, grasps the hilt of the Master Sword, and pulls out the legendary weapon. In a shocking twist, things don't turn out the way you would expect them to. As soon as Link pulls the blade out of the pedestal, the gate to the Sacred Realm opens up. just as Ganondorf enters the scene. The king of the Gerudo had suspected that Link was the one who had the spiritual stones in his possession, and so he followed the boy to the temple. More importantly, there was something else neither Link nor Zelda were aware of. To open the Door of Time, one must use the spiritual stones and the Ocarina of Time, but there is one more step that must be completed before the gateway to the Sacred Realm can be opened. That step is pulling the Master Sword out of its pedestal. The catch, of course, is that only a certain person, one with the spirit of the hero, can pull the blade out. It is revealed that Ganondorf had been aware of this all along, that he had actually been planning this from the beginning. By releasing the Master Sword from the pedestal of time, Link inadvertently opens the entrance of the Sacred Realm to Ganondorf. The Gerudo King mocks Link for doing his work for him, telling him that if he hadn't pulled the Master Sword out of its pedestal, the gateway would never have opened, and then proceeds to enter the Sacred Realm. It gets worse though. Link is able to pull the sword out of its pedestal, which means that obviously the sword recognizes him as the reincarnation of the hero of the goddess, and acknowledges him as its wielder. As it turns out though, the Master Sword deems him to be much too young to accomplish the Herculean tasks that must fall upon the shoulders of the hero, and deciding that he is not ready for the challenges that lie ahead, it seals Link away in the safety of a palace known as the Temple of Light in the Sacred Realm, putting him in a slumber that lasts for 7 years. And that's it for part 2. When we come back for part 3, we will take a look at the events that unfold in the second half of Ocarina of Time, including Link's climactic battle against Ganondorf, and the Gerudo King's transformation from a man into the apocalyptic force of evil known as Ganon, who goes on to feature heavily in future installments of the franchise, before moving on to explain the infamous timeline split. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.